So we're back with lesson 3. We've done a little for loop practice. Colt and I was suggesting you could try commenting out the response.write to see if your console log works, or to even do your console log before your response.write. Okay, we can maybe look at it after class. Okay, so gonna do quick intro to Express. So Express kind of sits on top, of the HTTP module that comes with Node that we used in files like this one. But Express is a lot more fully featured. Okay, so we've used a simple web server before, but in terms of scaling that out to manage all kinds of different URL requests, um, the HTTP module really isn't scalable for that. So we've got Express instead. So it's a middleware. It extends the functionality of the HTTP module, basically using callbacks, so we can route different URLs. We can instruct what our app should do when we get a request at a specific URL. So typically it will perform some logic, return a response, and then call the next middleware. So it uses this object called the dispatcher, and it interprets our URLs for each request, and then it decides where to send them. So in Express, we have to do this manually. When we were working in the .NET world, the dispatcher in our MVC application, it interpreted those URLs, and it would automatically know what controller to go to and what method. Whereas with Node and Express, we have to set up all the URL mapping manually. So creating a simple Express page, we're going to start here. It's as simple as requiring Express, which we'll have to install with npm. We then are creating a new Express application. And much kind of like our HTTP module, it has a listen method that will start our server. So let's try this out. What I'm going to do, I'm going to rename our original server file. And then I'm going to create a new file called server. So in my directory tree here, I'm going to rename this one. I'm going to call it first server. Or actually, sorry, I'll call it HTTP server. So this was the kind of our first hello world example that we did back a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to rename it to HTTP server so I can create a new file called server.js. So we're going to want to use Express here. In order to do this, we need to install the Express npm package. So we're going to run the command npm I express and while that's installing, I'm also just going to pop over to the Express homepage, which is at express.js.com. So we've installed Express. So it's a minimal, flexible web application framework for Node. And there's some simple examples here. I don't know if they've updated this. So we're basically going to do a couple of the simple examples that they've got. We'll play around with these. We can look at how the routing works. So how do we interpret different URLs? We'll play around with this and get this working. And then next week, we're going to have a look at the Express generator. This is a scaffolding tool. So it's kind of like the new MVC project template in Visual Studio, maybe not quite as fully featured, but this will generate an MVC application shell for us. It'll create things like a basic style sheet, views folder, public folder with JavaScript. So we'll work with the generator next week and moving forward. We're just going to kind of do manual Express. So once we've installed Express, we're going to include Express. And again, you could use let or const here. Then we're going to create a new Express application. So this instantiates a new Express object. And then we'll start the Express web server on port 3000. And we could log out a message. So this is kind of a substitute for, we're using Express instead of the HTTP module that comes with Node. So we can try this out, and then we could try loading localhost 3000 in our browser and see what we get. We'll also notice after installing Express, it gets added to the list of dependencies, our package.json file. It gets updated automatically when we run the npm install process. So I'll use nodemon to start our server. And I get a message saying Express is running on port 3000. So now I'll go back to my browser and refresh that URL. And we get this response, cannot get. So we haven't seen this before. This behavior is actually to be expected. Any guesses? I know this is new, so nobody knows for sure. What do you suppose this error means here? Cannot get. Our server is running, right? It didn't fail to connect to the server. The page, the URL, it recognizes that URL. Our server's running here, we can see in the console. So what do you suppose this cannot get message might mean? This response is suggesting something's missing from our code. Our server's running, but it's not. Okay, Ralph, you're getting warm. It isn't necessarily a directory, but you're on there. Okay, right, Chris. Right, we need to create a page or at least some kind of response, right? We haven't told the server how to interpret what to do with it when an HTTP GET request comes in at this URL, right? There's no instruction. So this cannot get. It's to be expected when our code runs this way. So each function in Express, much kind of like with our HTTP, we need to interpret the request and then decide what the response would be. Well, we haven't done this. So let's make a hello world. So we're going to create a hello function. So there's two steps to this. One is we're going to create a function that will print out a hello world message. And then we want to map any requests that come in to localhost 3000 slash hello. We're going to map all of these get requests to our function. So I'm going to use request and response. Express has one other parameter that's optional. It's called next. We're going to leave it out for now. We'll use it later in the semester. We don't need to worry about it for now. So our function is anonymous, right? There's no name. And in here, we're going to write our header of 200. And we'll set our content type. So similar to what we've done before. So we're going to write a header. And then we'll end the response by sending the message, hello world. So now what we want to do is direct requests to our response functions. So we can start with this. We're going to modify this in a minute. So this should get rid of our cannot get, because now all get requests will be handled by our function. So all URLs should now load our hello world message. Let's see how this works. So now I can go to any URL and our cannot get message is gone. Whatever URL we call, all requests are being mapped here to this function. Okay, so that takes care of our error. But obviously this is very limited because we get the same response no matter what URL we go to. And obviously no actual web application works like this. Right? The URL, a different URL, should give us some kind of different response. So let's flesh this out a little bit more. Let's create a goodbye function. It's pretty much identical, except we're going to print a different message in the response body. Again, we'll send an HTML response. This time we'll say goodbye world. So we've got two different responses now, a hello world response and a goodbye world response. But right now, the way our app is set up, it's using hello for all requests, right? Doesn't matter what URL we go to, we put on the end of localhost 3000, our response always says hello. So we want to set up some URL routing so that when we go to localhost 3000 goodbye, it should call the goodbye function. And when we go to localhost 3000 slash hello, then it should call the hello function. Okay, so we're going to map each URL to the appropriate function. So right now, this is sending all requests here. So we just get the same response over and over again. So this time, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a specific route. So we're only going to call the hello function when our URL is localhost 3000/hello. If I go back to my browser now, I can try some different URLs. So at localhost 3000/hello, I get hello world. At localhost 3000/goodbye, now we have our cannot get error messages come back. So how come I got the error? Why does the hello work, but goodbye gives me a cannot get? Right. You got it, Chris. We're now mapping this URL, but we haven't mapped any other URLs. That's right. So we're going to now app.use. We want to map the URL/goodbye to our goodbye function. So now we've got two different routes handled in our Express dispatcher. So this is our first kind of recognized URL, and here's our second one. So if I refresh now, hello works. Goodbye also works. What will we get in our root URL if I go back to localhost 3000 here with no URL suffix? If I just want to go back to the root, what's it going to do? So now we've got our cannot get. Again, how come this happened? Why didn't it show me hello or goodbye when I just go to my base URL? Exactly. We haven't set up what should happen in the root path. So let's set up one more function that gets called directly in our root. And then we'll need a third app.use. So I'll call this one maybe index. We'll set up our HTTP header. Keep my spacing consistent. Maybe we'll just have this response say homepage. So now I want to call our homepage function, our homepage response, when there is nothing after localhost 3000. So in this case, our path is just the root. Okay, so our slash is our root path. So now we've got three different URLs that Express is watching for. The root path, just localhost 3000, and then localhost 3000 slash hello and localhost 3000 slash goodbye. So now we get our home page, hello, and goodbye. Okay, so we're using Express to interpret these different URLs and then call different functions that contain different HTTP responses. Now we're almost done. I'm going to do a couple more things here. There's a couple of gotchas with this. I'm just going to move this up here. I'm going to put our root path first, and then hello, and then goodbye. So I can go to localhost 3000 and it loads my home page. That's good. Now I'm going to try the hello. But look at the response I got. Now I get the response of home page. What about goodbye? All my responses are now calling the index method. So why aren't these paths being executed? It worked before, right? When I had my hello, goodbye above the slash. So how come moving this line up here, why does it change the behavior of our application, do you think? When I go to slash goodbye, it's no longer calling my goodbye function. It's calling our index function. So moving this line seems to have affected the behavior. Why do you think that might be? Has to do with the way that the Express dispatcher is going to parse our URL requests. Colton says it stops the other after it finds the first one. That's exactly right. So how exactly is it finding the first one? Well, let's look at the URL carefully. Localhost 3000, right? In our goodbye path, what's before the word goodbye? There's a slash. So as soon as it encounters this slash, if this is first, these routes are in order of precedence. So as soon as it encounters the slash, it says, okay, I guess you want to call the index method. So it calls this code. So this means our root path should always go at the end. So order of precedence matters. So if this is like our default, we want it to be last in the list. And now our hello, goodbye, they all work again. So our root path, we need to make sure it goes at the bottom. That it gets interpreted only after our dispatcher says, nope, the request isn't hello, and no, it's not goodbye, then we'll look in the root. Otherwise, if we put the root first, it just overrides all the other URLs. And those other pages or responses will never get loaded. Now, normally, I mean, we're just sending text responses. We won't normally do this. We'll create views and we'll render or return the views in our response instead, much like we did in .NET MVC. So there is a res dot, not sure why it's not showing up here, but we can call res dot render if we wanted to, and it would load an HTML file. which is where we'll get to starting next week using the generator. So this is mostly working. There's still one more problem with it. It seems to work okay, right? The home page works. Hello works. And goodbye. We're getting the right responses at all of these. However, what do you think, what response are we going to get now? So we've mapped the route path, we've mapped hello, we've mapped goodbye. What kind of response will we get if we try any of the other URLs that aren't mapped? We haven't set out any kind of URL handling for a URL like this one. Okay? Colton says hello, Ralph says home page, Chris says an error page, or at least it should, right? Because that route doesn't exist in our app. So what happens? Yeah, so Ralph is right. And Ralph and Chris, I think both of you are right. It defaults because, again, there is a slash in our path. So it says, is the path hello? Nope. Go to the next route. Is the path goodbye? Nope. Does the path start with a slash? Yep. So it loads the index page. So what we want to do, Chris, I agree with you. We can let it call index, but we should write some logic in here. And says if the path is anything other than just a slash, we should send a 404 or a not found instead. So in our index, we're going to wrap this in a bit of logic. So if the requested URL is the root, show the home page. Otherwise, URL is unknown, so we want 404. So we can check if our request URL So this will tell us what comes after the domain. If there's only a slash and nothing more, then we want the home page. Otherwise, instead of a 200 response, we want to send a 404 status code. And we want to print out, like a page not found message or something. So again, we'll send our HTML response. But this time, our status code is going to be 404 not found instead. And the message we're going to send back is going to say, page not found. And I guess I could have used an H1 in all the other responses. I didn't think to do it. And whoops, my semicolon just to come out. So now we should be able to accept 3 URLs, hello, goodbye, or our root. And if any other URL is sent to the Express dispatcher, it should print out a page not found with a 404 response instead. So index is only going to print out homepage if our URL is the root. So again, we'll make sure, so my home page still loads. Hello and goodbye should be unaffected. Now if I put in some other URL, I should get a 404 and get our page not found, which I do. And if I check my console and go to network and reload, we can see that our status here is 404 as well. So in my root path, my status is 200, or hello, 200 OK. Goodbye is 200 OK. Anything else, we're going to get a 404 response. Okay, so this is the typical structure when we're working with Express. We're going to call app.use to map certain URLs. And we might map either to a specific function like we've done here, or eventually we're going to map to a controller, much like in ASP.NET. We'll say, any requests that come in at /reviews, they'll point to the reviews controller, for example. But this mapping, it all is done manually when we're working with Express. It's not automatic, like in our ASP.NET files where there's just a parser in startup that checks the URL and it knows based on the URL pattern to go to this controller and this method based on the URL. We're going to set up these instructions manually using the Express framework. So here's our simple example of a 3 kind of page. They're not really pages, but they look like pages, where we get 3 different responses and we're setting up the allowed URLs here. There's also this next function, which we'll look at later. I don't think there's anything. I put these slides up as a reference. They're in the lesson 3 folder for you, but basically just the example that we've done. Go to my terminal. I'm just going to stop my server. So this is our Express app. So this code, I've pushed it up to GitHub now if you need it. Any questions about our simple Express example? Anything that's really confusing? So we've kind of set up a manual Express app this week. Next week, we're going to use the generator to build an application kind of skeleton for us. And then we'll work in that same application for the next probably couple of months. And then later at the end of course, we'll come back and do one other example. We'll refactor that into a RESTful API, where again, we'll probably create the Express application manually. So you'll have some experience both doing it manually as well as working with the Express generator, we'll use both tools. Now you do have some work to do at home this week, okay, for next week. Number one is to complete your contribution to the NPM useful packages if you haven't already. I want you to have finished. If your for loop and your server.js aren't working, you can use my code on GitHub to go through those and get those working. You have both a lab and a quiz. Okay. The quiz will be available at 11 today, I believe. Both, it's in the lesson 4 folder. There's 5 short answer questions. It's not multiple choice this time. Okay, but you have until next Thursday, and we will go and have a look at lab 1 as well. Also do next Thursday night. So here's what I want you to do. Whoops. I just have to update that document. 1 second. Just a small adjustment I need to make. That should be 26. And I'll overwrite the file. Sorry, you can refresh the item. So you're going to make a new project called Comp2106 Lab 1. You'll initialize npm like we did last week in class, and this will generate a package.json file. I want you to install Express like we did today. And you can either create your own gitignore file and add the node modules like I did in class last week, or you can download the boilerplate gitignore file from here. So you can download it and include it in your project. Just be sure you save it as .gitignore. You're going to create a file called server.js that uses, this should say Express, sorry. You're going to use Express to listen for HTTP requests on port 3000 and shows a message in the console when the server started. You're then going to use Express to map 3 routes. So similar to our root, hello, and goodbye today. And your 3 routes will be /me, /mom, /dad. And then you're going to write an event handler for each, a request handler for each route, writing 1 or 2 sentences about this person in your family. So for example, for me, localhost 3000 /mom would give a response like this. Mom actually just turned 81 on Tuesday. So you only have to create, so there should be 2 files in your project, your gitignore file and your server.js. You'll upload to a private repository called Comp2106-Lab1. Make sure you give me access and just submit your repository link on Blackboard. Okay, so the code from today's file should be a good guide. Basically everything you need to do the lab is in the server.js. I've put it up on GitHub. Okay, and you have until Thursday next week both to complete the lab as well as the quiz, as well as filling in the npm packages spreadsheet. Okay, are there any questions about the quiz or the lab from anybody?
Nope.
Okay. If you do have questions when you start on them, feel free to send me an email or book an appointment for next week. If anybody needs help, I can stay in the WebEx room for a little while. If you have questions that you or problems you wanted some debugging help, then I'm available to do that. And if not, have an excellent weekend. I think it's finally supposed to be less frigid by Sunday, and I'll see most of you next week.
Thank you for the
Okay,
class.
thanks everybody.